We are finally
On Daniel.
starting the book of Daniel. And we're actually gonna make it through 2 verses tonight.
All right. Wow, that's awful radical.
But Daniel is an interesting book for a lot of reasons. One, the prophecies that are in Daniel are some of the most specific prophecies anywhere in the Bible. You know, you get into Micah and he's talking about red speckled horses and some of those kind of prophecies you really gotta dig and figure out what they're meaning, and even all this time later, some of the prophecies we still don't know what they mean, and there's a lot of people have their ideas, and in books like Isaiah and Ezekiel, there's some fairly clear prophecies, but then there's some like Ezekiel's vision with the wheel and the wheel, and I'm sorry if you ever meet a pastor that tells you he knows exactly what that wheel and the wheel is and all of that, don't believe me, because it's not there the things. But Daniel is very specific in his prophecies, and Daniel himself is an interesting person. And Daniel, the book is not laid out necessarily chronologically, especially the first 7 chapters, and we'll get into that a little bit more next time. It's more laid out where he's got certain things happening, but Daniel is really good about telling us where he is in time. In other words, when this person was king and when that person was king, and you'll see him kind of bounce back and forth. And this is a very interesting time in Daniel's life. It's one thing that's always bothered me in the book of Daniel is that we call him Daniel. We never refer to Daniel as Belshazzar. And Belshazzar is the name that the Babylonians gave to Daniel. They gave him a Babylonian name, which meant somebody who worships the god Bel is the name that they gave him, instead of giving him the name, letting him keep the name Daniel. But we always call him Daniel. But now Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we know them by Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even though those are their Babylonian names. Their names were changed to that. Their names were Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They're written down here somewhere on our notes. On the very second page, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those are their names. Those were the names that their moms gave to them. And when we get into next week's lesson, we're going to look at the meanings of their names. All 4 of these, their names had to do with worshiping God, had to do with glorifying God, different things along those lines. But all 4 of them had their names changed to honor a Babylonian god, one of the Babylonian gods. And so it's kind of to me, that's always been interesting that we keep the name of Daniel, but we go with the Babylonian names on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I don't think that it's necessarily that's easier to say than Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. But anyway. But I was thinking a lot as we get into this. It starts off. Let's just read these first 2 verses. And it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." Now, we have these 2 verses, and then we start a new paragraph in verse 3. And at the beginning of verse 3, we have Daniel and them already in captivity. Okay? And so it tells us a little bit here. It tells us when it happened in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim. King Jehoiakim was the 3rd to the last king of Judah. There were 2 more kings after him. His son, and then another guy named Zedekiah that Nebuchadnezzar puts in to be king before the city is destroyed. And so I was looking at this with Daniel and all of these kids that came. I think it's kind of important to get a good understanding of what molded these kids. Because these are young kids. We're anywhere between 8 years old to maybe 15 years old, kind of in that age range with the kids that were taken. So we don't know how old exactly Daniel was, but he was a young boy when he was taken off. And so it was common practice among the empires of that day to take these kids hostages, and they would set them up, and they would make them serve, they would change their names, they would change their culture, they would try to break them and mold them in to something else. And it was kind of common to do that. And so, but Daniel and them were in Jerusalem while all of this horrific stuff is going on. Now, the story of King Jehoiakim we find in the book of 2 Kings, we find it in the book of 2 Chronicles, and then we find it in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was Jehoiakim's prophet. He was the prophet to King Jehoiakim and to his father. Jehoiakim's father, you remember, was King Josiah. And Josiah was the one that took the throne when he was a little kid. And they found the book of the law, and he caused it to be read, and they all repented, and all that during that's Josiah. And then when Josiah died, and we'll get there as we go through. If we look at our paper, I kind of just made a timeline here. And I just want to tell the story of what's happening here in Israel, going through this timeline so we can see how it kind of breaks down. And it's interesting to me because in about 200 years before Daniel, we have Hezekiah is the king, and he's a good king over Israel. Isaiah is the prophet for King Hezekiah, and so my dates that I have on there could be off by a year or so, but as near as we can figure by adding up how many years each king lived and all of that. And with the Babylonian records of what year Nebuchadnezzar became king and stuff like that. So somewhere around 710 years before Christ, Hezekiah was king, and Isaiah made a prophecy to Hezekiah. And we see it here in the book of Isaiah. I've got it written there. I'll turn to it. Isaiah 39, 5 through 7. It says, Then said Isaiah to Hezekiah, Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days come, that all that is in thine house, and that which thy fathers have laid up in store until this day, shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, saith the Lord. And of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. Now this was some 200 years before they were actually carried off captive in that first captivity, and Daniel is carried off in what we call the first captivity. There were 2 or 3 times where they carried people out of there. Babylon was a nothing kingdom at that time. They were way over in the east. The big kingdoms were Egypt and Assyria. Assyria was up to the north. It was during Isaiah's time as prophet that Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, and so Isaiah, way before that, is already prophesying that Babylon is going to conquer Israel. Not just anybody, but that's kind of a specific prophecy. Where Israel is located, we know where Israel is located on a map, but back in those days, travel was very difficult. Trade routes were very, very important. In Israel, that land right there where they were, held the only 2 trade routes between the east and the north and Africa, Egypt, and the fertile Nile Valley. Everything had to go right through there. That's why under King David and King Solomon, they built up such great wealth, because they controlled the trade routes. And everybody that wanted to move anything from Egypt out west, if you go down south, if you would try to travel south of Israel through the Sinai Peninsula and then over across what's today around Iraq, it's desert. There's nothing. And it is dangerous. It was trying to carry fruit and stuff from one place all the way through. But if you went north up through Israel, and there were 2 trade routes, one of them right alongside the Jordan River and one right on the beach on the other side of the mountains. There was these 2 trade routes. And all the wars that were fought in that area were over control, basically to control those trade routes. And Israel is stuck in the middle. And Israel gets conquered a lot, but Jerusalem always stands because Jerusalem's up on a mountain, it's inaccessible, it's walled. And so even everybody would run into Jerusalem, and then eventually they get liberated and they own the country again. But even later on in history, the Greeks, the Romans, everybody wanted to hold that little piece of land, this fertile valley and these mountains, but where these trade routes were so that they could move products and armies and everything had to move right through Israel. And so that's why so much of early history centered right there, from everybody from Alexander the Great to the Roman emperors and the great, everything centered on that piece of land because that was just central to moving anything anywhere. To get all the way over to Babylon, they would go up north into what today is Turkey, and then through the bottom of Russia and around that way, and then back down along the river valleys to keep from having to cross the deserts and the wilderness that was inhospitable, and it was almost impossible to run merchandise through there. And so this is kind of talking about this because we see later on in 2 Kings chapter 22. Now Josiah's king, this is Jehoiakim's father. And year 640 BC, Babylon conquers the Assyrian Empire. And so now Babylon controls what used to be Israel, the nation of Israel, and up through Turkey and all the way over. So the two great empires were Babylon and Egypt. And Egypt controlled everything south of Israel. And here's Israel sitting in the middle between these two powers. And Egypt and Babylon go to war against each other. And Israel is stuck in the middle between them. And they just kind of become this fly. Nebuchadnezzar, he wasn't so much worried about conquering every city. He wanted those trade routes, and so did Egypt. So first, Egypt, when they go to war with Assyria, Egypt moves in first. And Egypt comes along, and they lay siege to Jerusalem long before Babylon did. This was under King Josiah. You can read about this in 2 Kings chapter 22 through chapter 23, in those two chapters. It talks about this war that's going on with Egypt. Egypt is between Egypt and Babylon. But what Josiah does is Egypt comes up and he camps in an area where Josiah doesn't want him to be camping. And so Josiah leads his army out of Jerusalem and out of the protected area, and he goes down south into the valley down there and tries to make Egypt move, and it doesn't work out real good for him. And Josiah is killed in that battle. And when Josiah dies, the people of Judah decide to name their next king, and they skip over Jehoiakim, whose real name was Eliakim. There's so many name changes everywhere in the Bible, you gotta watch out. But he had a younger son named Jehoahaz. And Jehoiakim was not really a nice young man, and everybody liked his little brother. And so the people came, and they rose his younger brother Jehoahaz up as king in Jerusalem. Well, Egypt didn't like Jehoahaz, and about a year later, looking at about 604 BC, Egypt invades, and they come in and they actually remove Jehoahaz from the throne. They carry him back to Egypt. They lay siege, and they raise up Eliakim, change his name to Jehoiakim, and demand that Israel pay tribute to Egypt. And Jehoiakim raises the tribute. Now we find this is in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 33 to 37. If you want to look that up. But Jehoiakim taxes the people. Instead of paying out of the royal treasury or from the temple gold, he takes, basically Israel walks off with everybody's money and leaves everybody in the nation with nothing. And they paid this tribute to Egypt, and Egypt then leaves Jerusalem alone, leaves Jehoiakim on the throne, but they tax heavily. And so it's not but 4 or 5 years later that Nebuchadnezzar drives Egypt out of what is today Israel. And he comes up And he comes into Jehoiakim, and he threatens at that point to kill Jehoiakim, to lay siege to Jerusalem. But what happens here is, this is the third year. Jehoiakim's been king for 3 years, and that's where we find ourselves in the book of Daniel, where it says the third year of King Jehoiakim. Well, he comes up and he demands tribute to them. Well, they've been paying tribute to Egypt by taxing everybody, and the people have nothing to give. The people have nothing to give to King Nebuchadnezzar. And actually, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar's dad is still king. Nebuchadnezzar is the captain of the armies that are invading Judah at this point. And so they take the tribute money that they need to pay to Babylon out of the temple. All the temple gold and the artifacts and all of that temple gold and all of that. And that's where we see they didn't take all of it. In verse 2 of Daniel 1, it says, Jehoiakim, it says, with part of the vessels of the house of God that he carried off. And so he went in and got the tribute that he demanded and gave them there. And we know also that he demanded them to pay a yearly tribute. That every year they would have to pay a tribute. And at this point is when he carried the first group of hostages out of Israel. So we have these children. Most of these children were going to be the children of, we see it in, let's go over to 2 Chronicles chapter 24. Verses 5 through 8. No. That's wrong. It's not chapter 24. I wrote down the wrong scripture. It's going to be, I think it's 34.
You say 34?
Yeah. Let's just say, I'm 34. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, 36. I don't know why I got 24 there. 36. 2 Chronicles 36, verse 5. It says, Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord his God. And against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. He didn't carry him to Babylon then. Somehow, reason, after he bound him in fetters, he let him go back into Jerusalem for 3 more years. And that's recorded in the book of Jeremiah. He said, Nebuchadnezzar also carried of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. And then it goes on the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim. And so he carries off them, he carries some kids off. Now, Jerusalem, we know from reading Jeremiah, was really in bad shape. The last 2 or 3 kings of Israel were, the conditions in Jerusalem were horrible. When Babylon and Egypt started fighting, everybody from the countryside, Sunday morning, the story we read Sunday morning, that family had come into Jerusalem because of Nebuchadnezzar, and that was in Jeremiah chapter 35. But all of the farmers, everybody all around, they'd left their farms, and they'd left their flocks, they'd driven what they could, and they had all come to Jerusalem, inside the walls of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was packed, just packed. And there was nowhere to sleep. They were just sleeping out in the streets. There was just only the land right there close around Jerusalem could they go out and farm, and not always even then. There was at times there were armies sieging and all this stuff going on. And so these young men who had been used to being kind of the pampered elite, probably, the rich kids, the sons of the princes and the sons of priests. Now all of a sudden, for several years of their life, they have been in Jerusalem, in this situation. This war is going on, the uncertainty, everybody, the crowded conditions, there's no water. As Nebuchadnezzar comes and begins to lay siege, if you read through Jeremiah, it talks about all the horrible conditions, how there was nothing to eat. And the story where the woman, we know the story where the woman comes to Jeremiah to complain that last night we ate my baby, and we were going to eat her baby this tonight, but she went and hit her baby and was complaining. That's during that, because the babies were going to die. There was no food to feed the babies. They were going to starve to death and people were starving to death every day. They couldn't even open the gates to take the bodies out of the gates, and so they couldn't bury anybody. When somebody died, they just lay in the streets to rot. They couldn't get in or out, and the food couldn't get in. They were talking about that a piece of bread was, worth half a year's salary. It was just, you couldn't buy bread, you couldn't buy things to eat. And so at this first carrying away, it wasn't to the end of that, but that was the situation they were in. And to go in, as Nebuchadnezzar comes in and grabs these kids, probably bound them up in chains and walked them out of the city of Jerusalem. And I don't know that his army went in and grabbed them. These kids were given up as part of the tribute that he paid to Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar demanded that. So if you could imagine your parents giving you up, and your city and your king coming and getting your children out of your house and putting them in chains and just giving them to this army that's camped outside. And we don't know exactly how many kids were taken. It's estimated that probably 300 or 400 youth were taken at this time, including Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, these four. And well, next week as we start getting into the story, I wanted to get into this history because there's something different about those four than about all the rest of them. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us that all the rest of them were evil. We really don't know much about them, which probably means that they pretty much just little by little adapted to Babylonian life. They were taught the language and taught the customs and ate the food and did everything. And it's not that they were evil, horrible people, but there was something different in these four young men. Now, the book of Daniel covers the rest of Daniel's life up to when he's an old man, and prophecies and all the things that he does. But it begins here at this point. Now, after they're carried out, it's not the end of Jerusalem. We know that it's about 600 BC, that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, that they were carried out. Jehoiakim is ordered to pay yearly tribute. 3 years later, Jehoiakim doesn't pay the tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. And Jerusalem is besieged again, and Jehoiakim tries to escape Israel, the city at that time, with a small band, goes out, he's captured, and he's killed right outside the gates of Jerusalem. And his son, Jehoiachin, becomes king. And then we go down to 592 BC, about a year later, Nebuchadnezzar comes back for his next yearly tribute. Every year they come back, and it's like, it costs money to keep an Babylonian army in Judah. And the ones who had to pay that were the people of Judah. They had to pay tribute to feed the soldiers and everything, and all that goes on. And you think about soldiers, mercenaries, and all that stuff being camped on your land, eating everything you've grown, slaughtering all of your livestock, the raping and the pillaging and all that goes on all outside the city of them, and then coming and demanding that you pay for it. Right? So every year, Nebuchadnezzar would show up and demand his tribute. And so he comes and he surrounds the city again a year later in 592 BC. And Jehoiachin doesn't have anything to give. There's nothing to give. And so he comes in and he takes Jehoiachin and carries him off captive. Okay? And as he's carried off captive here, this is in 592 BC, and this was the big captivity. Okay? They carried off a bunch. And this is where Ezekiel is carried off captive. If we look in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 1, he tells us when he was carried off captive. It says, "Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, I was among the captives by the river of Chebar." And in verse 2, "In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity." So Ezekiel starts 5 years after that, which would have been, if that was 592, then that would have been like 585, I guess, 584, 585. About the time that they're destroying the walls and everything around Jerusalem. So our, what we call captivity prophets is Daniel, who is a prophet during the captivity period from the capital of Babylon. And Ezekiel, who is a prophet of the captivity, and he's alongside the river Chebar, which is up north of Babylon, up in the old Assyrian provinces, where that group was carried off captivity, and there was King Jehoiachin at that time was up there. They were all taken up there. And Ezekiel's book is really interesting because he's kind of like Walter Cronkite for the people there that are in captivity. God is giving him visions of what is happening to Jerusalem. And so Ezekiel is telling and acting it out. In fact, at one time, he builds a little clay model of the city of Jerusalem and brings stuff up and lays siege against it. And he's telling everybody there, showing them dramatically everything that's happening to Jerusalem. And some of the strangest kind of visual prophecies we find in Ezekiel. But that was Ezekiel. And then Jeremiah stays in Jerusalem to the last day, to the very end. And he stays there and prophesies until the end. And so that was in 592 BC. Nebuchadnezzar comes. He besieges Jerusalem. This is like the third time Jerusalem now has been under siege. He carries off Jehoiachin, and he carries off at that time all of the rest of the temple treasures, all the gold out of the temple, everything that remained. He carried off all the important priests, princes, captains, including Ezekiel. 10,000 people were carried out of the city of Jerusalem into captivity that day. And then we get 2 Kings 25, Jeremiah 52 talk about this. But at this time, Nebuchadnezzar names Zedekiah to be king. Zedekiah was like a governor or something, but he wasn't in the royal line. But he named Zedekiah to be king. And we look here, and he is king for 10 years. 11 years. But in the 11th year, he doesn't pay tribute. He starts making deals with the Egyptians, and he's thinking that the Egyptians are going to come up and save him from the Babylonians. And it doesn't work. And this is where things get really bad. This is the final siege of Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar comes, this is in 582 BC, and his armies besiege Jerusalem, and they stay under siege this time for 2 years in that city. And they eventually dig down and block the wells that they had found. They had wells that went up through the mountain that brought fresh water into the city of Jerusalem. And they dug down outside of the city and spoiled the water in those wells that was coming up in, so it was poison water, or else it would run down the side of the mountain and not make it into Jerusalem. So finally they had no water, they had no food. For 2 years nobody could enter or leave the city of Jerusalem. and no food to get in. And that's where things got bad. And finally, at the end, the people themselves, out of desperation, killed Zedekiah, opened the doors, and they came in. The temple was destroyed completely, totally razed. The walls were torn down around Jerusalem, and the rest were carried off. Everyone was carried off captive except for the poor. They left the poor. And then they moved people in, and it was kind of the practice there is they would carry people off in captivity. Well, people that they conquered in other places, they just moved people around. They didn't take all of them back to Babylon. They took them to Damascus, or they took them to the River Chebar, or they took them to different places. And then people that they conquered in Damascus, they moved down to Jerusalem. And they just moved everybody everywhere. Nobody spoke the language, and in that way they ensured that nobody could rebel against them. And Nebuchadnezzar holds power there. And we know the next kingdoms, history tells us, and Daniel's going to tell us what goes on. So I wanted to kind of build a base for where we're starting. That this has gone on. This is why Daniel is in Babylon. And this is the circumstance that he is in. And just thinking about Daniel, bound in chains, with a bunch of other kids, dragged from the parents' home, and left right in the middle of all this war, and not knowing what's happening back in Jerusalem, and carried all the way across the globe, just about over to Babylon, which is over on the other side of the Sinai Peninsula. It's way over there on the Persia, on the other side of Iran, basically, where the Persians are. So he travels all the way through Iraq, all the way through Iran, clear over there to the farthest point east, which is interesting because that's where Abraham came from in the beginning. And he's carried back there to the capital city, probably Susa. We know it was in Susa. And they are brought in, and they're set in that. And so I was just kind of thinking as I was looking at this about Daniel's character and how that, sometimes adversity, some people crumble under it, and some people shine through it. Sometimes when things aren't going well, sometimes it tears some people down, but sometimes people stand up. And we don't know a lot about the other three. There's one chapter that deals with them, and we know the story in the fiery furnace, and we'll get there in our study. But then after that, we don't hear about them anymore. But Daniel,